Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This video is based on key insights from the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Introduction. John Perkins begins by stating that everyone across the globe is affected by a strategy designed to benefit a small group of powerful people. He explains that this isn't a new idea. Empires have always tried to take advantage of others, but today it's disguised as helping countries grow and become wealthier. Perkins reveals he once believed he was doing good work, using numbers and studies to prove these projects were helpful, but he later realized it was a deception. He illustrates this with a simple example. If a few very rich people make a lot of money while many others lose money, the average might look good, but it hides the real inequality. The core of this strategy, Perkins explains, involves wealthy nations offering loans to poorer nations that have valuable resources like oil. The loans are specifically for companies from the wealthy nation to build things like power plants. This creates profits for those companies and a few local leaders, but the country ends up in debt. When they can't repay, they're forced to sell their resources cheaply and often have to accept strict economic rules that benefit the lenders. Perkins calls this debt trap diplomacy. He notes this system relies on four things: making people afraid, creating debt, making them feel like they don't have enough, and dividing them against each other. Perkins details how the strategy changed over time. After the Vietnam War, the U.S. shifted from using military force to using debt as its main tool. Then, after 9/11, the U.S. military became prominent again, while the debt strategy continued. This is where China saw an opportunity. Perkins argues that China learned from the U.S. and modified the strategy, making it even more effective. China, under President Xi Jinping, began offering a different message. Instead of demanding changes to a country's government, China promised partnership and non-interference. They offered loans for infrastructure projects, claiming they wouldn't tell countries what to do. Perkins points out this is appealing, especially to countries that have been pressured by the U.S. However, he cautions that China often breaks these promises, and that projects are sometimes poorly built and benefit Chinese companies more than the host country. Perkins highlights how China has altered the four pillars of the strategy. While China hasn't used military threats as often, it focuses on fears of poverty and distrust of the U.S. It offers debt, but claims it won't control a country's policies. It promises to end shortages and presents itself as uniting the world through trade, rather than dividing it. However, Perkins warns that this unity is under the control of an authoritarian government. Perkins emphasizes that despite these changes, China is still using the same basic tactics of exploitation and control. He believes it's crucial to understand this strategy to address the growing problems facing the world. He shares his experiences speaking at international summits where people contrasted China's success with the U.S.'s struggles, noting the rising wages and reduced poverty in China. The author acknowledges his own biases as an American and asks readers to point out any prejudices he may have overlooked. He hopes the book will inspire people to work together to create a more just and sustainable world, and to reject the harmful economic hitman strategy in all its forms. He stresses the importance of recognizing that the pursuit of endless growth and wealth is damaging the planet and its people. Perkins believes that recognizing the deception is the first step towards creating real change. Part 1: Harbinger for the Future. John Perkins recounts the story of Rafael Correa, the former president of Ecuador, and his attempt to break free from American influence by turning to China for economic help. Correa's early life was shaped by negative experiences with U.S. policies, including his father's imprisonment and witnessing U.S.-backed coups in other countries. He believed the U.S. used debt to control nations, a strategy Perkins himself once practiced as an economic hitman. Correa aimed to build a fairer economic system for Ecuador, even enshrining the rights of nature in its constitution. Correa's boldest move was declaring a large portion of Ecuador's debt illegitimate, debt accumulated under previous, often undemocratic, governments. This angered the U.S. financial institutions, who lowered Ecuador's credit rating as punishment. Undeterred, Korea sought loans from China, securing billions of dollars for infrastructure projects like roads, schools, and hospitals. He believed this partnership would lift Ecuador out of poverty and offer a new path, separate from American control. However, the story takes a dark turn. While initially successful, the Chinese loans came with hidden costs. The massive hydroelectric dam project, built by a Chinese company, was plagued with problems. Cracks in the structure, silt buildup, and even electrical grid failures. Corruption was rampant, with many officials involved in the project facing imprisonment. Ecuador found itself deeply in debt to China, forced to offer a significant portion of its oil reserves as collateral. Perkins details how China's strategy mirrored the very tactics he once employed for the U.S., using debt to gain control. He notes the environmental damage caused by Chinese mining operations in the Amazon rainforest, a region vital for biodiversity. The author highlights concerns about China's human rights record, questions Korea himself wrestled with, regarding whether China would be any less exploitative than the U.S. The situation in Ecuador became a cautionary tale. While Korea initially envisioned China as a savior, the reality was a new form of dependence and potential exploitation. Perkins emphasizes that China's actions weren't necessarily about ideology, but about securing resources and expanding its influence. He points out that China's investments in infrastructure across Latin America and Africa are rapidly increasing, challenging U.S. dominance. Perkins reflects on the parallels between the U.S.'s past actions and China's current strategy. He suggests that the U.S., blinded by its own power and internal issues, failed to anticipate China's rise. He frames Ecuador as a canary in the cage, a warning sign of a larger shift in global power. The author questions why countries are so willing to accept Chinese investment despite the risks, suggesting a failure of the U.S. to offer a more appealing alternative. Ultimately, Perkins paints a picture of a world where economic control, regardless of who wields it, can lead to exploitation and environmental damage, and where recognizing these patterns is crucial to preventing further harm. Part 2, 1963-1971. John Perkins recounts a journey from idealistic Peace Corps volunteer to a self-described economic hitman, revealing a system designed to benefit American corporations at the expense of developing nations. His story begins with a post-graduation desire to avoid the Vietnam War, leading him and his wife, Anne, to Ecuador with the Peace Corps in 1968. What initially seemed like a mission to help communities quickly revealed a darker reality, a world where economic power was used as a tool of control. Perkins details his shock at the poverty in Ecuador, a stark contrast to the luxury of the Intercontinental Hotel where Peace Corps volunteers were briefed. These briefings hinted at the coming oil boom, promising prosperity, but also foreshadowing a system of exploitation. A pivotal encounter with a Texaco seismologist opened Perkins' eyes to the true nature of the game. This man casually described how Texaco essentially controlled Ecuador through its influence over the military and its ability to write laws favorable to its interests. The oil boom wasn't about helping Ecuadorians. It was about maximizing profits for Texaco and other American businesses. Perkins realized that the promise of wealth was a smokescreen for a system of debt and control. This realization mirrored his own upbringing, recognizing parallels between the oil companies and the merchants who profited from the California gold rush by selling supplies at inflated prices. Perkins' experiences in the Amazon and Andes further solidified his understanding of this system. He witnessed firsthand how local communities were terrorized and exploited by wealthy families who controlled the economy. His attempt to help brickmakers improve their situation was thwarted by violence and corruption, highlighting the power of those who benefited from the status quo. He learned that true change required the communities themselves to stand up to their oppressors, a lesson that would shape his future actions. Upon completing his Peace Corps service, Perkins was recruited by Chaz. T. Main, Inc., Maine, a consulting firm that operated in the shadows. Through a series of interviews and a relationship with a mysterious consultant named Claudine Martin, he was groomed to become an economic hitman. Claudine explained the core strategy: to create debt traps for developing nations, ensuring their long-term dependence on the United States and American corporations. This involved inflating economic forecasts to justify massive loans, which would then be used to fund projects that primarily benefited U.S. companies. Perkins learned that the goal wasn't necessarily to help these countries, but to control them. The system relied on fear, debt, and exploiting a sense of inadequacy to maintain power. He discovered that the U.S. had adopted this strategy after the Iranian coup of 1953, realizing that economic manipulation was a safer and more effective way to exert influence than military intervention. The role of organizations like the World Bank and IMF was to facilitate this process, providing loans with conditions that favored American interests. Perkins' training emphasized the importance of secrecy and the understanding that once someone became an EHM, there was no turning back. He was being prepared to become a key player in a global system of economic exploitation, a system that continues to shape the world today. The author's narrative subtly suggests that similar tactics are being employed by China today, seeking to establish its own sphere of influence through debt and economic control. Stopping this requires awareness, transparency, and a commitment to fair and sustainable development practices. John Perkins recounts his experiences preparing for a job in Indonesia with Maine, a company secretly working to benefit American interests. He learned about Indonesia's history, discovering it was once highly valued by colonial powers for its spices and resources, and later a target for influence during the Cold War. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, saw Indonesia as a crucial country to control, especially as the Vietnam War wasn't going well. Perkins' job, as part of a larger plan, was to help build an electrical system, but the real goal was to make Indonesia dependent on American aid and businesses. Perkins' excitement about the job slowly faded as he learned more. He realized the project wasn't about helping Indonesia, but about securing American dominance and access to its resources, including potential oil reserves. He felt conflicted, especially as he continued a secret affair with Claudine, a woman connected to Maine who warned him to never reveal their relationship. His marriage was falling apart, and he felt increasingly like he was living a double life. This internal struggle highlighted the moral compromises he was making. The author's arrival in Jakarta was a shock. He expected beauty and exotic culture, but found widespread poverty and suffering alongside the luxury enjoyed by foreigners. This stark contrast made him question the true purpose of his work. He met Charlie Illingworth, his project manager, who openly discussed the mission to save Indonesia from communism and ensure it benefited American interests. Charlie's focus was on maximizing profits for American companies, not improving the lives of Indonesians. Perkins' task was to create economic forecasts that would justify large loans and investments from the World Bank. He was expected to be optimistic, even if it meant exaggerating Indonesia's potential for growth. He clashed with Howard Parker, a seasoned forecaster who refused to inflate the numbers. Howard warned Perkins he was selling his soul and becoming part of a corrupt system. Perkins initially dismissed Howard's concerns, believing he could separate his work from the larger agenda. However, witnessing the extreme poverty in Jakarta and Howard's strong moral stance began to weigh on Perkins. He felt trapped, realizing his work would likely worsen the situation for ordinary Indonesians. He struggled with the idea that he was contributing to a system that prioritized profit over people. When Howard became ill and returned to the United States, Perkins felt a sense of relief, believing he was no longer responsible for the outcome. But this relief was short-lived, as he understood the larger plan would continue regardless of his individual actions. The chapter reveals a system where economic development was a tool for control, and where individuals were pressured to compromise their ethics for the sake of national and corporate interests. Part 3, 1970-11975. John Perkins found himself promoted after a trip to Indonesia, but the victory felt hollow. His boss, Bruno Zambati, had fired a colleague, Howard Parker. Because Parker's economic predictions weren't ambitious enough specifically, they didn't foresee the massive economic growth Bruno wanted to claim for Indonesia. Perkins was chosen to replace him, tasked with creating forecasts that would justify huge loans and projects. This immediately raised a red flag for Perkins, hinting at a system where numbers were manipulated to serve a predetermined outcome, a form of corruption. Perkins' search for Claudine, his contact, turned up nothing, leaving him feeling used and alone. This personal disappointment mirrored a growing unease with his work. He began to see the Indonesian leaders he met with not as partners, but as people pressured to comply with a hidden agenda. They used subtle language, referring to him as an inquisitor or interrogator, suggesting they knew he wasn't there for honest collaboration. This highlighted a pattern of deception and control, where local voices were silenced and genuine needs ignored. A shadow puppet show became a turning point. The performance boldly criticized the United States and the World Bank, portraying America as greedy and exploitative, and Indonesia as a resource to be plundered. The puppeteers' depiction of Nixon tossing countries into a bucket, symbolizing their economic domination, deeply affected Perkins. He realized that many Indonesians saw the U.S. not as a helper, but as an imperial power. This experience forced him to confront the negative consequences of the economic help he was providing. Conversations with Racy and his friends further challenged Perkins' worldview. They accused the U.S. of racism and a desire to control the Muslim world, referencing historical predictions about a clash between Christianity and Islam. They saw the World Bank as a tool for American dominance, a way to exploit their country's resources. Perkins, though initially defensive, found himself questioning the motives behind the projects he was supporting. He began to suspect that the promised economic boom was a facade, a way to justify debt and control. Perkins noticed a disturbing pattern. Meetings were difficult to arrange, information was carefully controlled, and everything presented to him was overly optimistic. He realized he was participating in a game of deception, where trust was absent and the true goal was to secure economic leverage. This realization led him to compare the situation to the pre-Civil War South, where a powerful elite benefited from exploiting others. He saw the modern corporatocracy as a similar system, driven by greed and a belief in its own superiority. The chapter culminates with Perkins receiving another promotion, an opportunity of a lifetime from Bruno. However, this promotion feels like a trap, a deeper entanglement in a corrupt system. Perkins is increasingly aware that he is contributing to a global power structure that prioritizes profit over people, and that his work is part of a larger pattern of economic exploitation. He begins to question whether the benefits of this system outweigh the harm it causes, and whether it's possible to stop the cycle of debt and control. The question of how to counter this system, and specifically how to address the growing influence of China, remains unanswered, but the seeds of doubt and rebellion have been sown within Perkins. John Perkins arrived in Panama in 1972, already aware of the country's history of struggle against American influence, particularly concerning the Panama Canal. He quickly recognized Omar Torrijos, the nation's president, as a leader determined to change that dynamic. Perkins' task was to create a development plan that would secure billions in loans for Panama. But he soon discovered this was a deceptive tactic to re-establish American control through debt. The chapter highlights a deep-seated corruption within international aid and development, where assistance isn't about helping countries, but about controlling them. Perkins' conversations with Fidel, a Panamanian government representative, revealed the stark contrast between the opulent American-controlled canal zone and the poverty-stricken areas inhabited by most Panamanians. This illustrated a clear example of economic exploitation, where the benefits of the canal flowed almost entirely to the United States, leaving Panama with little gain. The author began to question the role he was playing in perpetuating this system. Torrijos understood this dynamic perfectly. He knew the U.S. wouldn't simply allow Panama to gain true independence, especially with the canal at stake. He drew parallels to Guatemala, where a democratically elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown by the CIA for threatening the interests of the United Fruit Company. The core of the chapter revolves around Perkins' meetings with Torrijos himself. The general was a charismatic and compassionate leader who genuinely cared for his people. He wasn't interested in personal wealth or power, but in securing a better future for Panama. Torrijos was aware of the corruption inherent in the system and openly discussed the potential for the U.S. to eliminate him, just as they had eliminated Arbenz. He was determined to build a different kind of Panama, one that wasn't beholden to American interests or communist ideology. He wanted to improve the lives of his citizens through genuine development, not through debt traps. Torrijos challenged Perkins to do something different, to create a development plan that truly benefited Panama, even if it meant sacrificing potential profits for Maine and its partners like Bechtel. He understood that the U.S. often used inflated project costs to indebt nations, and he wanted Perkins to avoid that trap. This presented a moral dilemma for Perkins, who had previously been complicit in this very practice. The general also expressed concern about U.S. training facilities in the Canal Zone, which were used to train dictators and their security forces in methods of repression. The chapter subtly touches upon the issue of rising global powers, though not directly framing it as a China takeover. Torrijos mentioned considering Japanese investment for a new sea-level canal, potentially bypassing American companies like Bechtel. This hints at a shifting global landscape where countries were beginning to explore alternatives to U.S. dominance. Torrijos's desire for Panama to be a model for other nations, independent and focused on the well-being of its people, was a direct challenge to the American model of economic and political control. Perkins realized he was witnessing a pivotal moment, a potential turning point in the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America, and he was caught in the middle. He ultimately agreed to work with Torrijos, despite the risks, feeling a growing sense of guilt about his past actions and a glimmer of hope for a different future. John Perkins recounts a period in the early 1970s where he began to see how powerful countries manipulate others for their own gain. He worked as an economist, traveling the world and advising nations, but he slowly realized his role wasn't about helping countries develop, but about making them dependent on the United States. This dependence, Perkins explains, was a form of economic control, a subtle but powerful way to exert influence. He describes a growing sense of unease, as he understood he was part of a system that prioritized profit and power over genuine progress. The oil crisis of the 1970s became a turning point. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, demonstrated its power by controlling oil supplies, threatening the economies of major industrial nations. Perkins observed that while this seemed like a challenge to established power, it was actually being used to strengthen the existing system. He notes a cynical realization that even events that appeared to shift the balance of power were often orchestrated or exploited by those already in control. He felt conflicted, enjoying the perks of his position while witnessing the manipulation of other countries. A key example of this manipulation involved Saudi Arabia. After the oil embargo, the United States offered Saudi Arabia a deal: support and protection in exchange for keeping oil prices stable and investing its oil wealth in American companies. This was formalized through the United States-Saudi Arabian Joint Economic Commission, JECOR. Perkins was directly involved in planning this, tasked with finding ways to funnel Saudi money back into the U.S. economy through infrastructure projects. He describes it as a money laundering affair, where American firms were hired to build up Saudi Arabia, ensuring profits flowed back to the U.S. Perkins details how this system relied on importing foreign labor to do the actual work, creating a cycle of dependence. He recounts a disturbing episode involving arranging for a woman for a Saudi prince, paid for through inflated expense accounts, as a way to gain influence and secure the deal. This illustrates the lengths to which those involved were willing to go to maintain control. He notes the revolving door between government positions and corporate jobs, individuals like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger moving between the Treasury Department, companies like Bechtel, and positions of power, highlighting the close ties between government, corporations, and the military. The author points out that this pattern wasn't new. He draws parallels to earlier interventions, like the CIA overthrow of democratically elected governments in Iran and Chile, demonstrating a consistent strategy of maintaining control over resources and markets. He suggests that the system wasn't just about economic gain, but about maintaining a global empire. He observes that Robert McNamara, formerly Secretary of Defense, transformed the World Bank into a tool for furthering this empire, pushing loans and projects that benefited American companies. Perkins then reveals a troubling connection between this system and the rise of Osama bin Laden. The United States, with Saudi Arabia's help, funded the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, inadvertently creating a network that would later become Al-Qaeda. He details how Saudi money, channeled through charities, supported extremist groups, and how the Bush family had close ties to Saudi Arabia and the bin Laden family. This illustrates how short-sighted policies, driven by economic and political interests, can have devastating consequences. The author's narrative suggests that corruption is inherent in this system of global economic control. It's not simply about individual bad actors, but about a structure that incentivizes manipulation and exploitation. Stopping this, Perkins implies, requires exposing these hidden connections, challenging the power of corporations and governments, and promoting a more equitable and sustainable global economy. He doesn't directly address China's rise in this chapter, but the underlying theme of powerful nations manipulating others for economic gain clearly applies to current global dynamics. The lessons from the past, as Perkins presents them, suggest that vigilance and transparency are crucial to preventing a similar pattern of control from emerging with any nation. Part 4, 1975-1981. John Perkins recounts a period of great success in his career, quickly rising through the ranks at Maine, a consulting firm specializing in international development. By 1977, he was a young partner, lecturing at Harvard and enjoying a comfortable lifestyle. However, this success came with a growing awareness of his own privilege and the problematic nature of his work. He acknowledges benefiting from advantages based on his race, gender, and nationality, and admits to being initially blind to the unfairness of the system. This realization forms a backdrop to his involvement in the Panama Canal negotiations and a new forecasting method designed to justify debt. Perkins details how he and a mathematician, Dr. Prasad, developed the Markov method, a complex economic model used to prove the benefits of large loans to developing countries. In reality, this model was a tool to encourage countries to borrow money they couldn't repay, benefiting Maine and other U.S. companies. Despite knowing this, Perkins continued, driven by professional ambition and a sense of being caught in a system he didn't fully understand. Simultaneously, he maintained a secret agreement with Omar Torrijos, the leader of Panama, to ensure their studies considered the needs of the poor, a practice that drew suspicion from his colleagues. The Panama Canal negotiations became a focal point. Perkins believed the U.S. should relinquish control of the canal to Panama, a stance he publicly expressed in an op-ed piece for the Boston Globe, risking his career at Maine. While his boss, Bruno, tolerated his views because of the continued contracts with Torrijos' government, Perkins began to question the ethics of his work. He wondered if Torrijos regretted their agreement and if their honest approach had inadvertently created new problems. He feared that refusing to participate in corruption might make Torrijos a target. The narrative then shifts to Iran, where Perkins encountered a vastly different situation. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Iran had the resources to fund its projects without debt, but was strategically important to the U.S. due to its oil reserves and geopolitical location. Perkins describes a concerted effort by the U.S. government and businesses to portray the Shah as a progressive leader, overlooking his authoritarian rule and a history of U.S. interference in Iranian politics. A turning point occurred when Perkins received a secret invitation from a man named Yaman, a supposed radical, who wanted to show him a different side of Iran. This led to a clandestine meeting with a man known only as Doc, a former advisor to the Shah who had been brutally punished, his nose cut off for opposing the regime. Doc revealed the Shah's government was deeply corrupt and unsustainable, warning Perkins that the country was on the brink of revolution. He urged Perkins to convince Maine to withdraw from Iran, predicting they would not be paid if they stayed. Doc believed that even a single company leaving could inspire others and potentially avert a violent upheaval. Doc's story highlighted the dark side of the development process, where foreign aid and investment were used to prop up a repressive regime and exploit a country's resources. He explained that the Shah's ambitious projects, like the Flowering Desert scheme, were not about genuine progress, but about enriching those in power and maintaining control. Doc's warning served as a stark reminder of the human cost of economic manipulation and the dangers of supporting corrupt leaders for strategic gain. Perkins was left grappling with the moral implications of his work and the potential consequences of his choices. In 1978, John Perkins unexpectedly ran into an old college friend, Farhad, in Tehran, Iran. Farhad warned Perkins to leave the country immediately, hinting at impending danger and his own involvement with a U.S. agency. Perkins took the warning seriously and flew to Rome with Farhad, where he met Farhad's father, a retired Iranian general who had once saved the Shah's life. The general expressed deep disappointment with the Shah, criticizing his greed and arrogance. He believed U.S. policies, particularly support for Israel and corrupt leaders, fueled hatred in the Middle East and predicted the Shah's downfall, linking it to the U.S. overthrow of Mossadegh decades earlier. This event highlighted a pattern of unintended consequences stemming from U.S. intervention. The general's words resonated with Perkins, recalling similar sentiments from colleagues Yaman and Doc. Despite knowing about the Islamic underground movement, Perkins and others had believed the Shah was widely popular. The general's conviction challenged that assumption, predicting a wider upheaval in the Muslim world. He spoke of Ayatollah Khomeini, a cleric gaining influence, though Farhad and his father didn't necessarily support his extreme views. They recognized Khomeini's growing power and understood his message of overthrowing the Shah and establishing a religious state. Soon after, bombings and riots erupted in Iran, leading to the Shah's exile and eventual death. The subsequent hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy and the failed rescue mission further destabilized the situation, ultimately contributing to President Carter's loss in the next election. Perkins observed that Maine, his company, lost money in Iran, as did others. He began to see a pattern. The U.S. often created situations that ultimately harmed its own interests. This realization led Perkins to reflect on the broader implications of his work. He started to question whether the U.S. truly understood its role in the world, and if its intelligence agencies were deliberately ignoring warning signs. The situation in Iran underscored a troubling truth. The U.S. seemed determined to deny its own responsibility for the problems it helped create. Shifting focus to Colombia, Perkins described it as a strategically important country, often called the keystone of South America. He explained how the U.S. had long viewed Colombia as a gateway to the rest of the continent for business and political influence. While Colombia possessed natural beauty and a history of relative stability, it was also plagued by violence, poverty, and inequality. Perkins' company, Maine, was involved in building a large hydroelectric power network there, a project funded by massive loans. He acknowledged that these loans often burdened the country with debt, serving the interests of the U.S. and its corporations more than the Colombian people. Working in Colombia, Perkins met Paula, a political activist and fashion designer. Paula challenged Perkins' worldview, pointing out the negative impact of his work on local communities and the environment. She revealed her brother was involved with guerrilla groups fighting against the dam project, highlighting the desperation of those displaced by development. Paula's perspective forced Perkins to confront the ethical implications of his job and the true nature of his role as an economic hitman. She questioned whether he was truly helping these countries or simply perpetuating a system of exploitation. Paula's influence led Perkins to distinguish between the ideals of the original American Republic, equality, justice, and the practices of the emerging global empire, which prioritized profit and power above all else. He realized that his work was part of a larger pattern of economic and political domination, similar to the military interventions he had witnessed in other countries. Perkins began to question his own motivations and the justifications he had used to rationalize his actions. He felt trapped, aware that leaving his job could have consequences, but increasingly unable to reconcile his conscience with his profession. He considered simply remaining silent, avoiding further conflict, and focusing on a more peaceful life, a path encouraged by Paula. John Perkins found himself questioning everything while stationed in Colombia, learning of leadership changes at Maine, the corporation he worked for. He expected a promotion, but instead, a growing unease settled over him as he reviewed his resume. It wasn't that the facts were wrong, but that they were carefully chosen to make his work sound more impressive and important than it truly was. This wasn't about lying, but about presenting a polished image that hid the real impact of his job. A job that felt increasingly connected to a larger, troubling system of global power. He realized his resume, like much of what happened at Maine, was about appearances, not reality. The author discovered that his work, and the work of others at Maine, often involved inflating the potential benefits of large projects in developing countries. These projects were often funded by loans, which left those countries deeply in debt. Perkins understood this was a strategy to control nations through economic pressure, a subtle form of imperialism. He felt responsible, as he had helped create these misleading documents, even though the company had systems in place that allowed for this massaging of data without his direct approval. He began to see his role not as a helpful economic advisor, but as part of a system that widened the gap between the rich and the poor. Perkins recalled a specific client, the U.S. Department of the Treasury and Saudi Arabia, a seemingly innocent line on his resume that actually represented a hugely significant, secret deal. This deal ensured a steady supply of oil to America, protected the U.S. dollar, and benefited American corporations, while also, unknowingly, contributing to the rise of Osama bin Laden. This single line showed how powerful and influential Maine's work truly was, and how it operated behind the scenes. He felt guilt over the role he played in the system, and the impact it had on people's lives. His travels and experiences, particularly a visit to Ecuador, further fueled his growing discomfort. He remembered a former colleague, Jaime Roldos, an Ecuadorian president who dared to challenge the power of oil companies and the influence of the United States. Roldos wanted Ecuador to benefit from its own resources, not just have them exploited by foreign companies. Perkins admired Roldos's courage and saw him as a potential leader who could inspire change. He also learned about accusations against the Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL, a missionary group of collaborating with oil companies to displace indigenous people from land rich in oil. These stories, though unproven, highlighted the lengths to which powerful interests would go to achieve their goals. The author felt a growing sense of responsibility to change his own life. He realized that he had been deceiving not only the world, but also the people he trained. He had created a system where success meant delivering the results that pleased him, regardless of the ethical implications. He had unintentionally shielded his employees from the moral complexities of their work, and he felt guilty about it. He began to see the system as corrupt, built on fear, debt, and division, and ultimately self-destructive. During a sailing trip in the Virgin Islands, Perkins had a turning point. He reflected on his life, his parents, and the history of the islands, which were once built on the backs of enslaved people. He realized he had been complicit in a modern form of enslavement, exploiting developing countries for the benefit of powerful corporations. This realization led him to a powerful decision. He returned to Boston, and on April 1, 1980, he resigned from Maine. He understood that staying would mean losing himself completely, and he chose to take responsibility for his actions and seek a different path. Part 5, 1981-2004. John Perkins details a period following his departure from Maine, an organization he describes as manipulating developing nations for the benefit of powerful corporations. He left, troubled by his role as a slaver, but found re-entry into the world complicated by financial realities and lingering obligations. A request to act as an expert witness, justifying a controversial nuclear power plant, pulled him back in, though he increasingly questioned the ethics of his work. This led him to found Independent Power Systems, IPS, a company dedicated to environmentally sound energy solutions. Perkins observes a shift in American political leadership with the election of Ronald Reagan, marking a move towards a more aggressive, empire-building foreign policy focused on controlling resources, particularly oil. He contrasts this with Jimmy Carter's focus on peace and reducing oil dependence. This change in power, Perkins argues, had deadly consequences for leaders in Ecuador and Panama who challenged the established order. Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, attempting to reform his country's relationship with oil companies, and Omar Torrijos of Panama, who secured the Panama Canal Treaty, both died in plane crashes shortly after taking stands against corporate and U.S. interests. Perkins strongly implies these were assassinations, orchestrated to send a message to others considering similar resistance. The author notes a pattern of powerful entities silencing opposition. He points to the Summer Institute of Linguistics, an organization he alleges colluded with oil companies, and its expulsion from both Ecuador and Panama, followed by the deaths of the presidents who dared to challenge it. The narrative highlights the influence of corporations like Bechtel, deeply connected to U.S. political figures, and their vested interests in maintaining control over global resources. Perkins illustrates this with Bechtel's opposition to a Japanese plan for a new Panama Canal, fearing it would exclude them from a lucrative project. Perkins then turns to the case of George W. Bush and his early ventures in the oil industry. He details how Bush's company, Harken Energy, received preferential treatment, including securing oil drilling rights in Bahrain, seemingly due to his father's position as vice president. This example, Perkins suggests, demonstrates the pervasive corruption and influence of powerful networks within the U.S. government and the energy sector. He describes a system where connections and political power trumped merit and fair competition. Throughout the chapter, Perkins expresses a growing concern about a global power structure dominated by corporations and their allies in government. He sees the deaths of Roldos and Torrijos as evidence of a ruthless willingness to eliminate anyone who threatens this structure. He frames this as a continuation of a long history of intervention in developing nations, where leaders who prioritize their people's interests are often undermined or removed. Perkins' founding of IPS represents his attempt to counter this system by promoting sustainable energy solutions and challenging the dominance of traditional power structures. He believes that while empires eventually fall, individuals like Roldos and Torrijos offer hope for a more just and equitable world. John Perkins details a shift in global economics during the 1980s, moving beyond traditional international financial manipulation to a more widespread corporate influence. He observes a new wave of executives, not directly recruited by intelligence agencies, but acting similarly by prioritizing profit above all else. This new approach, fueled by ideas from economists like Milton Friedman, encouraged companies to maximize profits regardless of social or environmental costs. Perkins witnessed smaller, independent energy companies being swallowed up by larger corporations, often through questionable legal tactics, and the original goals of energy independence being abandoned in favor of profit. He notes the strong ties between politicians, particularly during the Reagan and Bush administrations, and the oil and construction industries, creating a system where these industries heavily influenced policy. Perkins felt conflicted as his own company, IPS, thrived despite this trend, attributing its success to his past services to powerful interests. He saw this pattern repeating globally, with corporations seeking cheap labor and resources, often leaving devastation in their wake. He questions whether these executives ever grapple with the moral implications of their actions, recalling his own moments of doubt. The author's growing disillusionment, especially as a new father, prompted him to consider writing a tell-all book exposing these practices. However, he received threats against his family, forcing him to reconsider. A seemingly beneficial offer from Stone and Webster Engineering Corporation, SWEC, arrived, a lucrative consulting contract that required him to remain silent about his past and avoid writing anything critical of the company or its practices. Perkins reluctantly accepted, feeling he had no choice to protect his daughter. This felt like a bribe, a way to silence him and ensure his cooperation. He describes the experience as deeply compromising, a betrayal of his values and his country. The invasion of Panama in 1989 deeply disturbed Perkins. He believed the U.S. intervention was not about justice or democracy, but about controlling the Panama Canal and punishing a leader, Manuel Noriega, who was defying U.S. interests. He saw parallels to the earlier manipulation of Torrijos and questioned the true motives behind U.S. foreign policy. The invasion highlighted a return to aggressive empire building, prioritizing corporate interests over the well-being of a nation. Perkins continued to observe the growing influence of corporations and the expansion of the economic hitman model into new territories. He notes the rise of free trade agreements like NAFTA, which favored U.S. companies at the expense of other nations. He attempted to write about these issues, but faced resistance from colleagues who feared it would jeopardize their work. The author's experiences led him to believe that a fundamental shift had occurred, with corporate power eclipsing national interests. Following the events of September 11, 2001, Perkins felt compelled to finally write his story, believing it was crucial to expose the ongoing practices of economic manipulation and the dangers of unchecked corporate power. He understood the risks involved, but felt a responsibility to share his knowledge, hoping that public awareness could help prevent future abuses. He recognized that the forces driving this system were becoming increasingly powerful, and that a new wave of economic hitmen were actively shaping the world. Perkins' narrative suggests that stopping this pattern of corruption requires exposing these practices and challenging the dominance of corporate interests in global affairs. He doesn't directly address China's rise in this chapter, but the underlying theme of powerful nations and corporations exploiting others for economic gain is relevant to understanding potential future conflicts and imbalances of power. Part 6, 2004-2016. John Perkins recounts a frightening experience following the success of his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He believed exposing the system he once worked within would inspire change, but underestimated the power of those benefiting from it. He didn't believe in a single, grand conspiracy, but recognized a network of smaller, focused schemes designed to benefit corporations and powerful interests. Shortly after the book's release, Perkins was invited to speak at the United Nations. A journalist requested an interview and offered to pick him up from the airport. Perkins agreed, but this meeting led to a severe health crisis, internal bleeding, that required the removal of most of his large intestine. Doctors initially attributed it to diverticulosis, but Perkins couldn't shake the feeling he'd been poisoned, especially as the journalist vanished without a trace. This event sparked a deeper exploration into the world of conspiracies, though Perkins maintained his belief that these were smaller, targeted operations rather than a single, overarching plan. Perkins observed that the tactics he used as an economic hitman manipulating economies to favor U.S. and corporate interests, were now being applied globally, even within the United States and Europe. He saw a system fueled by fear, debt, and a sense of inadequacy, mirroring the Cold War tactics of demonizing communism, but now targeting different groups. He realized the system had evolved, becoming more sophisticated and deeply ingrained, making it appear normal to many. This realization brought feelings of guilt, as he reflected on his past actions and the leaders he'd influenced. The author's travels after his recovery led him to Istanbul, a city steeped in imperial history. He noticed a new generation of economic hitmen, working for thousands of corporations and investment groups, creating what he termed a death economy. This economy, influenced by the ideas of Milton Friedman, prioritized short-term profits over social and environmental well-being. Perkins outlined the core strategies of the system, using fear, creating debt, fostering anxiety, and dividing people. He contrasted this with a life economy, focused on long-term benefits for both people and the planet. Perkins detailed how this modern system operates, with corporations seeking favorable treatment from governments, competing for the lowest wages and regulations, and even resorting to blackmail. He noted the shift in justification for these tactics, from fighting communism to combating terrorism and promoting economic growth. He began to formulate a presentation outlining the key characteristics of both the death economy and the life economy, emphasizing the need for a shift in values. While in Istanbul, Perkins reflected on the enduring drive for control that has characterized empires throughout history. He realized the tools had become more efficient, creating a self-destructive system. He felt a growing anger at the way the system operates within the United States, using debt and fear to maintain control, and how powerful interests manipulate the political process. He saw the system coming home to roost, with tactics like increased surveillance and the influence of money in politics eroding democratic principles. Perkins concluded that the system had become stronger since his time as an economic hitman and posed an even greater threat to the world. John Perkins reflects on another major banking scandal in 2014, involving banks previously caught in the Libor scandal, alongside new players like Citicorp and J.P. Morgan Chase. These banks were found guilty of illegally manipulating foreign currency prices and faced over $5 billion in fines, with further penalties following soon after. Perkins notes the brazen nature of this cartel, as it was known internally, with members openly referring to themselves as bandits and mafiosi. He's struck by how different this modern corruption is from his own past actions. While he justified debts with economic models, these new bankers seem to care only about profit, showing a ruthless disregard for consequences. This realization leads Perkins to also criticize the regulators who allowed this manipulation to continue for years, highlighting a see-no-evil attitude within government agencies. He points out that the fines, while large in number, were insignificant compared to the bank's overall wealth, and shockingly, no bankers were criminally prosecuted. Perkins feels a growing frustration with the public's acceptance of this exploitation, comparing it to the attitudes he encountered during his earlier work, and cites examples like skyrocketing student debt, medical debt, and unfair tax laws as everyday forms of exploitation. The FIFA soccer scandal of 2015 further illustrates this pervasive corruption, even reaching into areas like sports. While initially relieved by the Justice Department's action, Perkins quickly realizes it was a distraction, diverting attention from the larger issue of banking corruption. He argues the Justice Department focused on FIFA officials while protecting the powerful bankers, demonstrating the influence of the corporatocracy. He recalls a conversation with Howard Zinn, who pointed out that politicians are now more loyal to their corporate funders than to the people they represent. Perkins reflects on his early days at the World Bank, remembering the motto, "Working for a world free of poverty," and how he initially believed it. He now sees this as a deception, realizing the bank's true goal was to expand corporate capitalism. He notes that wealth inequality has drastically increased since the publication of his first book, with a tiny percentage of the population owning almost half the world's wealth. Despite billions spent on development projects, billions of people still live in extreme poverty. He details how countries are burdened with debt, forced to prioritize repayment over essential services like healthcare and education. The author then shifts focus to the new breed of economic hit men, EHMs, that emerged in the new millennium. Unlike the relatively discreet methods of his time, these modern EHMs operate openly, influencing laws and politics through lobbying and campaign contributions. Perkins identifies 5 key examples: U.S. senators who become lobbyists after leaving office, corporate lobbyists who draft legislation, site location consultants who manipulate governments for corporate deals, tax and subsidy strategists who steal from taxpayers, and vulture capitalists who profit from countries in economic crisis. He illustrates these points with examples like Boeing securing massive tax breaks from Washington state and the exploitation of debt by vulture funds in struggling nations. Perkins then discusses the rise of jackals, those who carry out the dirty work of the EHMs, including surveillance, assassination, and torture. He details the increased use of drones, secret surveillance programs, and mercenary forces, highlighting the erosion of privacy and accountability. He notes the NSA's widespread surveillance of citizens and foreign leaders, and the use of private military companies to avoid public scrutiny. Perkins concludes that this system is undemocratic and driven by greed, and that it has paved the way for China's growing global influence. He fears that the U.S.'s own corrupt practices have opened the door for another nation to exert similar control. Part 7: China's EHM Strategy. John Perkins recounts a journey through recent history, detailing how China has risen as a global power and the ways its methods echo those previously employed by the United States. He observes a troubling pattern of corruption, not necessarily in the sense of bribery, but in the manipulation of debt and power dynamics to gain influence over nations. Perkins details how China, like the U.S. before it, utilizes a 4-pillar strategy instilling fear, creating debt, promoting a sense of insufficiency, and dividing to conquer to establish economic and political control. The author's experiences in Latin America reveal a shift in allegiance. Countries once reliant on the U.S. are now turning to China, drawn by promises of non-interference and infrastructure development. However, Perkins cautions that these promises often mask a similar pattern of exploitation. He points to Ecuador, where Chinese-funded projects like the Coca-Codo-Sinclair Dam have been plagued by problems, yet China continues to gain influence. He notes that while the U.S. often imposed political conditions on aid, China's approach, though seemingly more lenient, still carries risks of debt traps and compromised sovereignty. Perkins highlights the historical context of U.S. intervention in Latin America, detailing the support for brutal dictatorships in Chile and Argentina during the Cold War. He connects this past to the present, arguing that the U.S.'s history of meddling has created resentment and opened the door for China's influence. He describes how China's Belt and Road Initiative offers an alternative to U.S.-led development, but warns that it comes with its own set of challenges, including concerns about labor practices, environmental damage, and the potential for economic dependence. The narrative then shifts to Asia, where Perkins recounts his experiences in Indonesia and Kazakhstan. He describes how China has strategically cultivated relationships with Asian nations, offering economic assistance and infrastructure development while subtly expanding its political and military influence. He notes that China's approach is particularly appealing to countries wary of U.S. interference, but cautions that it is not without its drawbacks. He points to issues such as substandard construction, concerns about human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims, and the potential for debt distress. Perkins emphasizes that stopping China's global takeover isn't about hostility, but about recognizing and addressing the underlying issues that make countries vulnerable to manipulation. He suggests that a shift in mindset is needed, moving away from short-term profit maximization and toward a focus on long-term sustainability and the well-being of all people. He advocates for a global economic system that prioritizes cooperation, fairness, and respect for national sovereignty. Throughout the chapter, Perkins expresses a sense of regret for his past role as an economic hitman and a desire to create a more just and equitable world. He believes that by learning from the mistakes of the past, both the U.S. and China can work together to build a future based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. He stresses the importance of transparency, accountability, and a commitment to ethical practices in all international economic dealings. Ultimately, Perkins argues that the key to countering China's influence lies not in confrontation, but in building a better alternative. John Perkins details a world deeply affected by economic manipulation, focusing on how both the United States and now China use similar strategies to gain influence, often leading to corruption and exploitation. He recounts his past as an economic hitman, someone who would convince countries to accept loans for large projects, knowing these loans would likely be unpayable, leading to control by foreign interests. Perkins emphasizes that this isn't just about money, it's about power and control over resources. He notes that while the U.S. initially relied on fear of communism to justify its actions, China now offers seemingly beneficial deals, infrastructure projects, and loans that often come with hidden costs. The author explains how China's approach in places like Angola and Iraq demonstrates a pattern. In Angola, despite its wealth in resources, the people remain impoverished while China gains access to valuable minerals. In Iraq, China secured oil deals and built infrastructure, but also faced accusations of poor construction and exploiting the country's resources. Perkins points out that China often steps in where the U.S. has faltered, offering loans and investment when the U.S. withdraws support, creating a dependence that benefits China. He highlights that this isn't necessarily about malicious intent, but about a system that prioritizes economic gain over the well-being of nations and their people. Perkins describes how China's strategy involves forgiving debts, building infrastructure, and offering seemingly favorable trade deals, but these often come with strings attached. He uses the example of Montenegro, where a Chinese-funded highway project became incredibly expensive and ultimately led nowhere, benefiting primarily Chinese companies and corrupt officials. He contrasts this with the U.S. approach, which often involved imposing conditions on loans and supporting regimes that favored American interests, even if those regimes were oppressive. The author stresses that both approaches contribute to a cycle of debt, dependency, and corruption. The narrative shifts to Europe, where Perkins observes a growing tension between reliance on American security and economic ties with China. He notes that China's Belt and Road Initiative offers attractive investment opportunities, but also raises concerns about debt traps and political influence. He illustrates this with the example of Serbia, where Chinese investment has led to environmental problems and accusations of corruption. Perkins emphasizes that China's strategy isn't about direct military control, but about economic dominance and building a network of countries dependent on China's economic power. Perkins acknowledges that stopping China's growing influence isn't simple. He points out that many countries, including those in the Middle East, are turning to China because they feel abandoned by the U.S. He suggests that the key to countering China's influence isn't through military force or economic competition alone, but through a fundamental shift in how global economics operates. He argues for a move away from the death economy, a system based on endless growth and exploitation, towards a life economy that prioritizes sustainability, social justice, and the well-being of all people. The author concludes by reflecting on his own role in this system and the need for greater transparency and accountability. He suggests that recognizing the patterns of economic manipulation and challenging the underlying assumptions of the current economic model are crucial steps towards creating a more just and sustainable world. Perkins believes that understanding how both the US and China operate and acknowledging the shared flaws in their approaches is the first step towards breaking the cycle of corruption and preventing a global takeover by either power. He implies that a collective effort to prioritize people and the planet over profit is essential to building a better future. Conclusion: we each have a role to play to end the EHM strategy. John Perkins concludes his book with a strong call to action, arguing that both the United States and China are engaged in a harmful strategy he calls EHM, economic hegemony manipulation, which essentially means controlling other countries through debt and influence. He believes this system is failing the world and needs to end. Perkins explains that the U.S. traditionally offers loans and infrastructure projects with strings attached, pushing countries to adopt policies that benefit American companies. China, he says, operates similarly, offering loans and construction projects, but with the expectation of trade partnerships and political alignment. Both approaches, according to Perkins, are modern forms of colonization, focused on exploiting resources and power for a select few. The author contends that corruption is at the heart of this problem. It's not just about money changing hands, but about a mindset that prioritizes short-term profits over the well-being of people and the planet. Perkins doesn't directly address stopping China's global takeover as a military or political battle, but rather as a shift in thinking. He believes the focus needs to change from competition and domination to collaboration and sustainability. He suggests that the US and China, as major players in the world economy, have a responsibility to lead this change. Perkins emphasizes that individuals have a crucial role to play. He urges readers to challenge their own beliefs and encourage others to do the same. He identifies 4 key areas for transformation: overcoming fear of other cultures, ending the use of debt as a control mechanism, shifting away from a mindset of scarcity, and rejecting the idea of us versus them. He proposes that instead of seeing other nations as enemies, we should recognize a common threat, a system that is driving us towards destruction. To combat this, Perkins suggests practical steps. He encourages people to support businesses that prioritize social and environmental responsibility, advocate for policies that promote fairness and sustainability, and use social media to hold corporations accountable. He provides a template for an email that readers can send to company CEOs, urging them to adopt more ethical practices. He also highlights positive examples, like the transformation of a former coal mining town in the Czech Republic into a cultural center, and the growing movement towards conscious capitalism and sustainable technologies. Perkins acknowledges that change won't be easy, but he remains optimistic. He points to the growing awareness among young people and the commitments made by some business leaders as signs of hope. He shares a story about Dr. John Cobb, an environmental advocate who wrote to the presidents of the US and China, urging them to cooperate on climate change. While he doesn't know if the letters were read, he believes they inspired others to call for unity. Ultimately, Perkins believes that by changing our perceptions and taking action, we can create a future where prosperity is defined by benefiting all life, not just a privileged few. He encourages readers to find their own unique way to contribute to this transformation, emphasizing the importance of finding joy and fulfillment in the process. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.